Hello, and welcome everyone to the launch of the 2021 Girls Education Roadmap. I'm Erin Ganju, Managing Director of Echidna Giving. We hope that you are all safe and healthy. These continue to be challenging times around the world, and we are sincerely grateful for you for joining us today, as we know how valuable your time is. And we're excited to share with you the launch of the 2021 Girls Education Roadmap. This roadmap distills key insights from the Evidence for Gender and Education resource, or EAGER. There's been incredible interest in EAGER and in this roadmap, with hundreds of people joining us for this webinar. So as colleagues continue to dial in, we want to take a moment to learn more about you. As Meredith shared at the beginning, we invite you to go to menti.com. We'll be using this throughout the webinar to ask engaging questions. Please use the code on your screen, 6024320, to share your input throughout the webinar. And we'll start with an easy question. We'd love to know, what region are you based in? Now, while we're looking at calculating the results, I want to briefly introduce two of today's speakers. We've developed a great partnership at Echidna with the Population Council. The team there has worked tirelessly to create EAGER and this roadmap. To kick us off, you'll hear from Stephanie Saki, Director of the Council's Girl Innovation Research and Learning Center, or aptly named Girl Center, and Nicole Haberland, a Senior Associate at the Council. They will share a brief overview of some of the most interesting takeaways from the roadmap. Really looking forward to hearing them speak soon. And a bit later, we're very excited to have Justine Sass of UNESCO and Manisha Shah of UCLA, an affiliate of JPAL, to join for a panel discussion. Now, let's look back at the results and see where everyone is joining us from this today. Okay, great. Well, given the time zone, I'm not surprising to see we have a lot of North America and Europe, but we've got some good representation, and this will be recorded and shared with our colleagues around the world. So it's great to see people coming in from all various regions. And again, please keep using menti.com throughout the webinar as we engage with all of you. So at Echidna, we've invested in EAGER as a resource intended for the global girls education community. We're grateful that many of you took the time over the past few months to share your feedback and insights so that the Girls Education Roadmap, which draws out key lessons from EAGER, can be valuable as possible as we really face the task of having to build back better post-COVID-19. One of the goals of the roadmap is to bring together different kinds of actors in the global girls education space, including other donors as well as program implementers, researchers, advocates, and policymakers. So we'd love to know, as our next question on menti.com, which groups you represent. Please answer this question on menti.com so we can all see the different roles we each play in the education community. While you're doing that, I'll share a bit more about why we decided to invest in the work of the EAGER and the roadmap. At Echidna Giving, our sole aim as a private funder is to support quality, gender-sensitive education for boys and girls in lower-income countries. We've been funding work in gender and education space for over 10 years. We still struggle with fundamental questions around how we can connect evidence and impact in our sector. We continually are asking ourselves, where has the world made progress in helping girls succeed, and where are there persistent gaps and challenges for girls? Do we really know what works best for girls at different stages in their educational life cycle? And why is it hard to connect the great work that we're all doing, sometimes with really rigorous evidence? And more recently, how does COVID-19 change what we thought we knew about the most important investments and program work, or how can we build on what we already know? And we thought that perhaps if we were struggling with these questions, maybe others in our community were as well. So we decided we wanted to help create a resource for the whole girls' education community. The goal of EAGER is twofold. First, to drive more focus on smarter investments and better evidence programming. And second, to build connections and partnerships to drive progress forward. Now, let's go back to see the results from menti.com. Key to building these partnerships is to make sure that we really bring people together. So let's see where the different areas that we're all coming from. We have a lot of program implementers and researchers. That's great to see. And several also in the category of advocates and donors, and a few policymakers. Hoping more will join and listen to this. So it's great to see that exactly the resource that we've created of Eager in this roadmap. We're getting many of the audience participation here today in this discussion. So the vision behind the roadmap is that those of us working on girls' education share a common destination to make sure all girls are in school and learning. But we don't always share a common path. And our hope is that Eager and the roadmap can be a resource for the community to join our paths forward and together accelerate progress towards our common goal. So with that, I'm going to hand it over now to Stephanie Nicole from the Girl Center to share more about the key takeaways for the roadmap that we can all learn from.
Hello, everyone. I'm Nicole Haberland, and I'd like to join Erin in welcoming you today. Thanks so much, Erin, for the great introduction and for sharing the amazing work you all are doing in Echidna Giving. So we're moving into year 2 of the COVID era, and I'm both exhausted, but I'm also so inspired at the incredible work our field, everyone in the audience and on the panel, has been doing to meet the unprecedented challenges to young people's education, health, and well-being. The issue, of course, is that even before COVID-19, we were struggling to address profound inequities and injustices. More young people than ever before were out of school, especially girls. Even when children are in school, they're often not gaining basic literacy and numeracy skills. And then after leaving school, young people, especially girls, are losing the skills they gained. With COVID, the resulting school shutdowns and the increased social and economic stressors that target the already vulnerable like a laser, the challenges and inequities have amplified. It also means that there are expanded demands clamoring for already limited donor funding. So now, more than ever, we need to make sure our investments are effective, smartly targeted, and driven with a lens of equity and justice. And this is no easy feat. With diverse institutional priorities and a cacophony of advocacy messages and research reports, it sometimes feels much easier to just put our heads down and do our work. What this moment demands, however, is that we do better. This is where the 2021 Girls Education Roadmap Report comes in. In a first-of-its-kind resource, we reviewed thousands of studies, documented hundreds of programs working across dozens of countries to figure out who's doing what, what's working where, and what are the biggest needs facing girls. The Girls Education Roadmap is free and downloadable on the Eager website, so we invite you to explore it and we welcome your feedback. And what's unique and so powerful about this resource is that it brings together and synthesizes 3 bodies of data that are critical to our success, but too often we don't have time to consult all of it or to make sense of the sheer volume of information. So in the needs section, we present current data on SDG indicators, not just for education, but also for structural drivers such as child marriage, poverty, and gender-based violence. The practice section draws on the Eager database and has documented over 250 organizations and 600 programs and is continually being updated and expanded. And we just added over 100 COVID-related programs to the database, so you can check them out on eagerresource.org. The evidence section summarizes findings from previous reviews of the education literature and includes the results of a new, about-to-be-published systematic review of interventions designed to address gender-related barriers to education. And then finally, we look across all 3 buckets to highlight alignments and misalignments between the 3 and identify gaps for future research, for innovation, and adaptation. So let's take a peek at some of what you'll find in the needs section of the roadmap report. A main organizing approach we take in the roadmap is looking at the data by barriers to education. This approach, thinking about barriers rather than just outcomes, can help guide decisions about the most effective policies or interventions in a given setting. So, for example, there are some barriers to girls' education, such as poor pedagogy, that are often shared equally with boys. Both girls and boys struggle with this barrier. Other barriers that in many settings are shared with boys but are more pronounced for girls, such as inability to afford tuition and fees, or school-related gender-based violence. Finally, there are those barriers, such as childbearing, that girls alone shoulder. So let's take a look at a couple of examples from the roadmap report. As we know, the poorest girls are at the highest risk of dropping out of school and often experience the largest gender gaps. And now, COVID is layered on top of that risk. For example, Pop Council researchers in Kenya are seeing emerging patterns of severe food insecurity for adolescents who were previously getting meals in school. Violence against women and girls is pervasive, as you know. And this figure shows that those with more education are often, though not always, less likely to experience physical or sexual violence. And while we can't determine from this data whether this association is causal, the different patterns may reflect different realities. For example, in settings where lower education is linked with higher levels of intimate partner violence, this may reflect underlying gender norms that both condone violence against women and are less supportive of girls' education. In settings where higher education is linked with violence, having more education than one's husband may put women at risk of intimate partner violence. The underlying dynamics vary from one setting to the next, and so must the solutions, as well as what synergies and spillovers we realistically can expect. Next, let's take a quick look into the practice section. The data in the practice section reflects the current state of global girls' education on the ground. And this is drawn from the eager database, which you can check out on eagerresource.org. And what we find is a rich and diverse ecosystem. Programs are aiming to improve educational attainment, learning, and gender equality. They predominantly employ multiple program components, for example, combining community awareness activities with provision of school uniforms. In fact, 88% are multi-component, each with their own unique combination of program elements. And just a small fraction of programs, just 11%, work through a single program activity. Despite the diversity, many programs share common approaches. For example, among programs that aim to increase educational enrollment or attainment, 31% use community engagement, a third provide gender rights and power education, 22% include empowerment training, 20% provide literacy courses, and 1 in 5 offer sexual and reproductive health education, including puberty education. Of the programs that aim to improve academic skills, between 1/4 and 1/3 report using literacy courses, community mobilization, numeracy courses, gender rights and power education, and in-service teacher training to improve pedagogy. It's notable that even when programs have different goals, they're often using many of the same approaches. So these are just a few examples of what you can find in the roadmap. There's lots more to explore, so check it out. Now I will turn it over to Stephanie. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nicole. So Nicole shared with you some key insights on the gender-related barriers to education for girls, as well as current work to address those barriers. The third piece of this puzzle that we've put together in the roadmap is around evidence. What do we know about what works to address those barriers to education for girls? To answer that question, as Nicole mentioned, we're drawing on two types of information. One comes from a recent systematic review that we've just completed, which focuses on programs designed to address gender-related barriers to education, the kinds of barriers Nicole was discussing. The second type of information is from what we call the general education evidence. These are often studies that test interventions for girls and boys together. And even though they're not focused on gender, they still provide valuable insights into how to improve education outcomes for girls. So taking all that evidence together, we summarize what's been shown to work in certain contexts to improve education outcomes for girls. There are 4 general approaches that have been demonstrated to improve girls' enrollment in school or attainment. They are addressing the cost of schooling, including through provision of conditional cash transfers, scholarships or school materials and uniforms, improving access to school, including through construction, provision of community schools or transportation, providing proper sanitation facilities in schools, especially sex-specific toilets, and providing food in school or as take-home rations. There are also a handful of approaches that have been demonstrated to improve learning, although much of this evidence is based on studies of girls and boys combined. Not surprisingly, most of these approaches relate to supporting teachers to teach effectively. They include improving pedagogy, for example, by using structured pedagogy and competency grouping, as well as using technology in a way that is closely linked with the curriculum. Related to this, ongoing teacher training rather than one-off trainings, school governance and accountability, and teacher contracts have been shown to be effective. On the student side, remedial education or tutoring for students who are struggling, merit-based scholarships, and providing food in school or as take-home rations have been effective. This does not mean that these approaches work everywhere or that they are the most cost-effective approaches. As Nicole mentioned, key to choosing the right approach is having a clear understanding of the most important barriers in each setting. This also does not mean that nothing else works to improve education outcomes. What it means is that based on our assessment of the literature, nothing else has been shown to work with sufficiently strong evidence yet. But that leaves us with some important barriers to girls' education that so far lack effective solutions, to our knowledge. Linking back to the information on current practice, we now know which are the most commonly used approaches in the girls' education field that have not yet been shown to improve education outcomes. They are life skills education, including content on gender rights and power and creating safe spaces for girls, efforts to create more gender-sensitive school environments, including through training in gender-responsive pedagogy, community engagement and efforts to increase support for girls' education, and provision of teaching materials. Again, and this is really important, the lack of consistent evidence does not mean that these approaches don't work. They may work to improve health outcomes, for example, or they may work to improve education outcomes, but we just don't have the evidence to prove it yet. This is a very important distinction. In fact, at the Population Council, we continue to use many of these approaches in our own work, even while the evidence is being collected. What it does mean is that if the goal of these approaches is to improve educational attainment or learning for girls, we need to better understand how they can be most effective. The hope of the roadmap is to lay out areas of alignment and disconnect in girls' education so that we can find solutions together. So what can we do to create better alignment between needs, evidence, and practice? In the roadmap, we've taken a closer look at areas of alignment and disconnect on several important themes. You can read much more about this in the full report, but I'll briefly share a few examples. We find, of course, that learning levels remain extremely low overall, and in some settings are even lower for girls than boys. And yet, girls' education programs continue to focus more on improving enrollment and attainment than on learning. Only 1 in 3 programs list improving academic skills as a goal. The good news is that if we look at the programs that do aim to improve learning, 2 out of 3 of them are using at least one evidence-based approach. Of course, we know the key to success is often in how these approaches are implemented in practice. With regard to gender-related barriers to schooling for girls, we also found quite a few disconnects between needs, evidence, and practice. One positive sign is that current programs largely incorporate attention to gender-related barriers in recognition of how important these barriers are for girls. Yet while many include content like gender rights and power education, only 1 in 5 addresses child marriage or adolescent childbearing, 2 of the most widespread barriers. At the same time, some of these commonly used approaches, like life skills education in safe spaces, have not been shown to improve education outcomes for girls. And finally, we can keep these lessons in mind as we respond to COVID-19 and look toward rebuilding. As schools begin to reopen, how can we support teachers to meet the needs of students, which are likely more diverse than ever? And how does this differ by gender? How can we increase the percent of girls' education programs that address food insecurity to tackle this growing crisis and also to ensure that girls return to school? And more broadly, we are under pressure to make decisions with limited evidence about what works to respond to this crisis. How can we build on what we already know? So to take a step back, what we find across multiple issues is that programs are not always implemented in the places where needs are greatest. They often do not adopt the most evidence-based approaches, and researchers often fail to evaluate the most commonly used approaches in the field. How can we bridge these divides? So before we turn to the panel discussion to try to unpack some of those questions, I'll end by encouraging you all to check out the roadmap report and read more about what we've shared and many other interesting insights that we didn't have a chance to talk about today. And I also want to encourage you to check out the Eager site to ask your own questions, share more about your own work, and find new ways to connect and partner with other organizations working to improve girls' education. With that, I will turn it back over to Erin.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie and Nicole, for sharing some really interesting takeaways from the roadmap. It is such a rich resource, and I thought it was really interesting, Nicole, that there are 88% of multi-component programs and they're completely unique. So there's a wealth of practices out there to learn from. And Stephanie, I thought it was really interesting that there's great opportunities to build, stronger evidence base and some very common approaches that we need to dig a little bit deeper around life skills and community engagement and gender sensitive school environments. So just great to hear all that we're seeing and learning and how we can build on this resource. With that framing in mind, we'll now turn to what I think will be an engaging and thought-provoking discussion with our panelists. I'd like to invite our panelists to turn your video on. And to our attendees, I'm excited to also continue to get your input throughout the discussion. So please keep Mentimeter up because we will in a few minutes have some more questions to engage throughout this discussion. On our panel, as I mentioned, we are joined by Justine Sass, who is the Chief of Section for Education in Inclusion and Gender Equality at UNESCO, and Manisha Shah, who is a professor of public policy at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs, as well as a JPAL affiliate. And then Stephanie Saki will continue to join us for some additional insights on the roadmap. So to start us off, I'd love to hear from Justine and Manisha whether you saw some interesting insights that kind of struck you as you were listening to the roadmap results that resonate from the work that you do. Justine, maybe you can start us off and then we'll hand it over to Manisha.
Thanks very much, Erin. I think for me, the most interesting part of the roadmap is that Venn diagram with those three circles and how thinking about how can we use this as sort of a diagnostic for us to think about, are we in that center space? Are we thinking about needs? Are we building on the evidence? And are we drawing on practice on what works? And how can we be in that space and grow that space is more important now than ever before with COVID-19 and really seeing this need for smarter investments, doing what works, what we know is coming out of the evidence, and catalyzing cooperation. So for me, this is a really interesting model for us as we move ahead. Sorry.
Thanks, Justine. So this is Manisha here, and I think first of all, I wanted to congratulate all of you on this amazing roadmap. It was a lot of fun for me to read it, and I guess as a researcher myself, I have to say my favorite chapter was the last chapter where you guys did a great job really laying out all of the evidence that exists, the evidence in practice chapter where you talked about what's been working, what hasn't necessarily been working, where we need to learn more about. And there was a nice sort of conclusion, sort of picking up on some of the questions I've seen in the chat as well, thinking about what the longer term impacts of COVID will be on all of this, of what we already know, what we'll need to know. Once girls stay at home due to school closures, once girls are staying at home because of negative household income shocks, what will their transition back to school look like? Will the transition happening, and what types of programs and policies might we need to think about if we're not seeing this transition back to schooling happening?
Great. Thank you both for digging in and reading the resource and developing those insights. I think just to go a little bit deeper, the roadmap really surfaces, I think, Justine, as you said so aptly, this need and tension between needs, evidence, and practice, the three circles in the Venn diagram. One aspect of that is to question, whether government policies and NGO programs are reaching those most in need. And before turning to the panel, I'd like to ask the audience for your thoughts on this and, the disconnect sometimes between needs and practice. In your work, what are some of the reasons that programs and policies fail to reach those most in need? As a reminder, it'd be great to go to the menti.com website and use the code 6024320. And we'd love to hear from this rich knowledge base of everyone listening here, where you see some of those failures. So while we're answering, Stephanie, can you give us a few more specific examples of how you see this playing out based on the data you've collected through Eager?
Yeah, it's so great to finally be able to share this roadmap and start to hear feedback from people outside of the process. So thanks also Justine and Manisha for taking the time to go through it. Yeah, I mean, I think the most obvious example that is not surprising to many of us about this disconnect is things like geographic disconnect. So the needs are so great in West Africa, for example, and often there's less investment in West Africa than East Africa, as an example. But as we were putting together this roadmap, we were also looking at different types of disconnects related to are the right programs being implemented in response to the barriers being faced in each setting. So for example, in certain countries, just looking at what level of education does the barrier emerge for girls? Is it enrollment in primary school? Is it dropout during primary school? Is it the linkage from primary to secondary or secondary completion? And what we often saw was that in settings where a lot of progress has been made on average and girls are largely entering school and even sometimes, even largely completing primary school, the real push now is needed for that transition to secondary and retention in secondary school, but the investments still continue to be focused on the primary school level or enrollment in primary and attainment of primary. And I think the other piece of this is thinking about targeting enrollment and attainment versus learning and figuring out what the right balance is and perhaps thinking that it's time to shift a little bit away from the central focus of enrollment and attainment toward, maybe broadening the focus to include learning given the very low learning levels for girls.
Great. Well, Justine, before we look at what the audience is inputting, I'd love to hear from you based on your work at UNESCO. I wonder if you can share some reflections on why resources you think don't always reach the groups that are greatest in need and what we could do as a field to really address this disconnect.
Thanks. I think a lot of them were laid out really well in the Mentimeter. One that wasn't for me, which I think is a really big one, is that we don't always know what the greatest needs are. I think we have a lot of barriers related to data, having timely, quality data. We're also not always taking the data that we have and using it to its full potential. We're not analyzing it, even from the most basic way of, disaggregating it and looking at it by gender, by location, by wealth, by ability and all of these other parameters. And then I think finally, when we are collecting data, we're not always addressing what is laid out very well on the roadmap as being some of these really important gender-related barriers, which are often outside of education, whether they be related to child marriage, adolescent childbearing, gender-based violence. And I think that those intersections aren't always well developed. The second area, I would say, is very much linked to what comes out of the Mentimeter, which is, I think, that it's often a choice to not invest resources in places with the greatest needs because they're the most challenging places to reach. As the roadmap points out, they're often the settings where girls are at the greatest disadvantage are often the settings where the education systems are the weakest. And so we're looking at challenges in cost, in effort, in risk, in reaching partners that may not be working in those settings. And so I think we're often going to populations that are easier to reach, even though we know that those are where the investments are most needed. And then I think just two things on, what I think we can do. The roadmap calls for some ways to better understand needs. I think there's a suggestion in one part of the recommendations under the needs section that calls for a shared framework of gender-related barriers in education, really looking at tools that can help us understand the needs to inform our policies and programs. I think that's something that is very much needed. I think Eager helps with that. At UNESCO, we have a database called WIDE, which is looking at disadvantage in education across different parameters. And I think we really need to start with really, exploring the data. And then finally, you can't change the context. Those contexts will remain to be, in many times, very difficult places to work. But what we can change is what we know. And I think what's coming out of this work, which is really interesting, is this sort of better understanding of what works to reach the hardest to reach in different settings, and really thinking about how to use that to improve enrollment, attainment, and learning for girls, even in contexts that are difficult, including those for crisis and conflict. And I think these are two challenges, and I think two ways that we can address them.
Terrific. Thank you, Justine and Stephanie. Those are great insights. And let's also see what the audience is perspective is on this question too. So we see a lack of funding. I take that to heart. I know many of us in the sector as funders are trying to encourage others and build a strong collaboration there. Political will is a challenge, certainly, and probably one that I know we're worried about in these times. The education, again, might get left out a little bit in terms of where some of the focus is. So these are great things to see. Logistics and safety. Terrific. Thank you. We'll have another Mentimeter question coming up in a few minutes. Now let's turn to some of the other interesting findings in the roadmap. There is a huge sort of focus on the evidence gaps around some of the most commonly used approaches that I mentioned in girls' education. For example, despite the very common use of life skills, we don't know whether and how this approach might improve girls' education's outcomes like attainment and literacy. And I think these are some of the important things that we can take to heart in looking at that connection of the evidence with where we're often commonly working. Manisha, maybe from your experience with program evaluation, you can share some insights and reflections on why researchers might be overlooking such important questions and what we can do as a field to really address this connect.
Sure, happy to, Erin. So as a researcher working on evaluating life skills curriculums and education myself, I'm happy to, and have a lot to say on this subject related to why research may be overlooking some of these types of interventions. I think there's a few issues. First, in terms of, let's take this life skills education as the example, right? And so if we think about life skills education, there's really no standard curriculum that we as evaluators might evaluate, right? And so if I'm evaluating life skills in Tanzania, it might look very different there than what life skills curricula in Nigeria look like. And this is also actually even true within country. I think the other thing about a lot of life skills education is that, some of it is happening in after school clubs, off campuses, taught by peer mentors. So other countries are doing it within schools, on school campuses, taught by teachers. And so there's just a lot of heterogeneity in terms of what these programs look like. An important issue, for impact evaluation and for evaluators is what the right counterfactual is. And so just to give you an example, I've been doing a lot of work with BRAC in Tanzania on their life skills programming. They already have 150 clubs that have been doing the work, but thinking about what the right control group, right, what the right counterfactual might be has been challenging. Now compare all of these issues that I've raised to something like conditional cash transfers, where we have a lot of evidence, right, that conditional cash transfers have done like a great thing for girls' education. But the thing about CCTs is it's generally easier to quantify the impact of these things because you're comparing apples to apples, right? The programs look very similar. And if you think back to like 1997 when the Mexican government was implementing Progresa, kind of our first big CCT, they did it in, they randomized who got the program and who didn't. So you had this nice treatment control group set up. And which means kind of years of possible research by social scientists and economists like myself who are sort of obsessed with causal inference issues. And so I guess the last thing I want to say, my sort of, call to researchers is obviously do more on this topic. My call to kind of countries and program implementers, especially who are working on life skills education, is to think a little more about implementation issues such that good evaluations might be easier to implement. And then the call to sort of funders and donors on these areas where we still need a lot more evidence is when you're funding a life skills curriculum or intervention, also thinking about funding and evaluation and encouraging the program implementers to also, hire independent evaluators or think about how they might do a serious evaluation of the program.
Great, Manisha. And Stephanie, do you have any quick thoughts you want to add to that also as a researcher and from the systematic review that EAGER team has been completed?
Yeah, I mean, Manisha is right on with all the things that she's saying, and I think we see that play out in a lot of ways in the systematic review. So definitely agree with this issue of it just a lot of these approaches not being well-defined in the sense that they might be well-defined in individual programs, but there's not a shared definition and a shared sense of components is a big challenge. And I think related to that, one of the challenges that we found in the systematic review, which is reflected in, what can we say works, is that most of these programs, as Nicole said, are multi-component programs. So they include things like, back to the life skills education example, you have the provision of life skills curricula, you have safe spaces, which is really a forum to deliver the curriculum, the person who's delivering it, which might be a mentor or a teacher or, a peer mentor. And then often there's other components, so provision of food within the safe spaces group, maybe scholarships at the school level. So one of the big challenges is just trying to understand which of these pieces is really driving the effects. And a lot of the interventions we're looking at are these large government programs that have multiple components for logical reasons and are very effective. But when we're thinking about scalability or adaptation to other settings, we really need to know from a cost effectiveness perspective as well, which pieces of this are most essential. So I think that's another kind of challenge we're grappling with. I just want to say, I'm thinking, listening to Manisha and some of the feedback that we got along the way from practitioners is that we don't want to conclude then that the only thing that can be done that's effective are simple approaches, because obviously these are very complex problems and they probably need to be met with complex, multifaceted solutions. So I think that's not where we want to end up. Maybe the intermediate step is to really try to agree as a community on, what's the core package of a life skills education intervention. Let's test that, have a clear understanding of whether that works, and then think about how it can be adapted across settings depending on the context.
Great, terrific. Yes, I think it's a really important point that the innovation and the creativity is not something we're saying shouldn't happen. It's more just how do we work together and collaborate better to ensure we're also building that evidence base. So moving on, I think the third main disconnect that emerges from the roadmap as we look at it is really related to policymakers and practitioners investing in evidence-based approaches. There's often this discussion about doing kind of what works, as it's simple, but the roadmap really makes it clear that many girls' education programs are missing the opportunity to incorporate some of the approaches that we know can work, like improving pedagogy and improving learning. As a funder in this space, as a Kindergiving, we want to make sure that grantees are obviously implementing programs that they see working and are building that evidence. But we also know that sometimes the best approaches, as we've been talking about today in the panel, are always context dependent, and it's there's not a one size fits all. So before we dig into this topic, I think it'd be great to turn again to our audience and get some of your input with our next Menti.com question about what are the biggest barriers to using evidence-based approaches to improving girls' education. What does our audience think about that? And while the audience is answering, Justine, maybe we can bring you back to share some of your reflections on what happens between that creation of this evidence, this sort of ideal evidence we want, and the actual process of developing and implementing a policy. Where does the process break down at times, and how can we do better? And then Manisha, it'd be great if you can join after Justine and really talk about the perspective again from a researcher of what do you think researchers can do to increase the chances that their work will be used by policymakers and other practitioners, that uptake of the evidence. So over to you, Justine.
Thanks, Erin. I think there are several different, ways along the pathway that things are breaking down. I think it starts with the generation of evidence and research itself, the lack of inclusion of policymakers in the design of research, the limited indication inside of research and evidence itself that thinks about the policy implications of the evidence as well. So for me, that's the kind of first breakdown. The second is the communication of evidence. I think often, for many major research reports, we're so happy to have it completed and to communicate the findings that there isn't perhaps the right kind of targeted communication channels used to reach policymakers. And so often, you can find your report in the markets instead of in the hands of a policymaker. And then I think at the level of the design of policies, and I didn't get a chance to look at the Mentimeter, I only saw the first one, but I could see that was one of them, which is really that, often the research and the evidence isn't available. It's not believed, or it goes against kind of common assumptions or what we think that we know. And, in that case isn't likely to get picked up. And I think what we need to do then is to be looking at how do we intervene at each of these levels? How do we ensure that the research and that, the evidence that's being collected is responsive to policymakers' needs, and that it includes policy implications, whether that be brokering conversations with policymakers to get there, to make sure that gets included. That could be one way to do that. I think, then communication obviously is thinking about who you're communicating to and your audiences. And I think for us, sitting inside the UN, we're also, pretty regularly thinking about how can we broker those worlds? How can we bring together the worlds of evidence and research and policymaking, and really offer a space for policymakers to be part of the research design, to interrogate the evidence and to use it in their practice.
Thanks, Justine. So just to sort of add to that, I do think historically there's been sort of a huge disconnect between what happens in the research community and then what is going on with policymakers. I do want to say that's been changing a lot recently with organizations like JPAL, where I'm an affiliate. And also I've seen a lot more emphasis from donors helping fund these types of relationships between research and policy. But I will definitely say that researchers still need to keep engaging and start engaging a lot more with policymakers. And I'll note that this isn't necessarily our expertise or like the things that we're terribly good at, but we need to see more of it. In fact, just to give you an example, I direct the Global Lab for Research and Action at UCLA. And the reason we started this lab was precisely this issue of like all this great research was happening within UCLA, but it was mostly, staying within the ivory towers. And you need these types of organizations who can translate research findings and get them to the policymakers, get them to the program implementers. You need these types of organizations who can amplify the research and get the word out. And I think we still need to see a lot more of that happening. I also think from the research community, one of the big problems is we often find null results. But because of the incentives that we have, a lot of these null results often don't get out to program implementers, right? And so there needs to be more of that happening. But I also think that program implementers need to be open to hearing about when their program isn't working, right? And to be able to sort of shift or innovate or transform or think about different strategies. Because, as Justine mentioned, I think there is often an issue there. And part of this is just, it's not clear that development practitioners themselves are always, incentivized to innovate as much as maybe they should be because of fear of losing funding or, how our systems work. And so I think all of us kind of pushing for this idea that we need to do more research, we need to communicate more with policymakers, but we also need to iterate and innovate and end programs that aren't working and experiment with new programs to see if they can work. And this needs to sort of happen maybe quicker than it has been happening.
Great. Thank you, Justine and Manisha. Well, let's see what our audience also wants to contribute to this and how they're viewing these barriers. So lack of access to evidence. I think we've highlighted that, and really being able to focus on how do we get it in the hands of those that are going to be using it and making policy decisions or enhancing programs. But also really, it's interesting that they're all very high and similarly placed in terms of confusion or contradictory evidence, as well as how to respond to donor requests, which we definitely know is a challenge, and lack of relevant evidence. So there's which is sort of almost similar to the first one. So there's really I think a lot of overlap in terms of what the panelists also shared in terms of some of the challenges that we see in this barrier. Well, I think it's time to start to wrap it up, and I think we'd be remiss if we didn't really connect this back to the moment in time that we're all in right now with the COVID-19 pandemic, which has affected all of our lives over the last year and the communities that we work in. And I think it would be important as we think about this moment and is often said, how do we want to build back better from it? What are some of the lessons and challenges that are important in this moment? And what really maybe is different and that we would do differently based on some of what we're seeing in Eager, and maybe what would stay the same or we should lean into. So Stephanie, I'll start with you, since you and the Eager team have reflected on this over the last year and are starting to incorporate some of the programs that you're seeing out there related to the COVID pandemic into Eager. And then Manisha and Justine, if you could also just share quick reflections as well as how you see this related to this important moment in time that we're in as well.
Thanks, Erin. Yeah, as you know, we started the work on Eager years ago, well before the COVID-19 pandemic. We launched the Eager site in mid-April from New York, which was quite an experience. And it's, I think it's been a challenging year around the world and for those of us in the US, certainly. So we definitely spent time reflecting on, how do we make sure that this resource is still valuable, both the Eager website, but also the roadmap in this moment. And we're thinking about it in terms of two questions that maybe are kind of obvious, but I think help us to focus our thinking. And one is, what are the core goals that we're trying to achieve right now? And the second is, what's the most effective way to achieve those goals? And so I think that certainly, the challenges have evolved in a lot of different ways, and in terms of access to school in one way, in terms of, the new economic challenges that are emerging. But fundamentally, I think where we're at is that the goals haven't changed. And there were a lot of challenges to achieving those goals before COVID-19, as Nicole said. And maybe really what we're thinking about is that in a lot of ways, this pandemic has made those barriers even more challenging. So the economic barriers are more challenging, access to school is more challenging. At the same time, of course, there's a need for innovation and thinking about new solutions in this moment, but we just want to be very mindful of the fact that we don't have the luxury of time right now to do a bunch of RCTs and do a systematic review and get a clear handle on what the bulk of the evidence is telling us. So we really need to make sure that we're building on what we already know about how to overcome cost barriers, access barriers to school, and then adjusting as needed. But maybe it's not as dramatically different as we might be thinking it is in terms of what's needed right now.
Great. Manisha, maybe do you want to jump in first?
Sure, happy to. Thanks, Erin. So I wanted to say a few words. I know this is a panel on gender and mostly a panel about girls' education, but I think as a researcher, I would be remiss if I didn't mention boys as well. And the reason I want to mention boys as well is that we've been doing a lot of work in Tanzania recently where we've actually been getting boys involved in some of the life skills training. And we've been finding really important improvements in adolescent girls, in that adolescent girls are reporting, reduced incidents of intimate partner violence in these communities where we've also been working with boys. And so I guess what the thing I want to put out there is, as we're thinking about gender and as we're thinking about girls' education, and, we talked a little about life skills training, I think it will be important to think about how we also include boys and young men, since we know that a lot of the issues we've raised today related to gender-based violence, COVID, unplanned teen pregnancies, all of these things obviously impact girls' schooling outcomes, but also involve boys.
Great. And last thoughts, Justine, from you.
Yes. So at UNESCO, we've been really concerned about what's happening with COVID-19 and the implications on education. In March of last year, we launched a global education coalition. We have more than 160 members. I think almost all of you here are members of the coalition, and we have a separate flagship, a gender flagship, which is really trying to understand what are the gender dimensions of COVID-19 and how can we work together to ensure girls' continuity of learning and return to school and build back. We're calling it Build Back Equal, so really thinking about how can we ensure more education systems that are much more gender responsive, that are really trying to understand the needs and address it. And I just wanted to say that we're, as part of the coalition, we've launched with the Population Council a global study on the gender dimensions of COVID-19 school closures. It's looking at the impacts, it's looking at good practice, and it's looking at trying to build some of this evidence base to help us undertake more evidence-informed programming, in what is at the moment the largest disruption to education that we've ever had. So watch this space. I hope we can do another webinar on this in a couple of months as well. Thanks.
Great. Well, we were definitely, I think this whole community here and our broader community I know is all working very hard on how do we build back. So anything that we can do to continue to share and use Eager as a resource and to use all of our institutional power to help with this, I know will be something we'll all be interested in. So thank you so much, Justine and Manisha, for joining today and sharing your insights. It's been great to have you contribute to this launch of the roadmap. And a sincere thanks to the Eager team. We've heard from Stephanie, Nicole, and Meredith today, but there's many others at the POP Council that have been working hard on this for a long time, as we have heard, and it's been a great partnership to really be able to launch this resource over the past few years. So as we close, I think we'll ask for input one more time. If you can share what you believe are some of the most important questions facing the girls' education field to our audience, we'll throw that question out to you on menti.com again. The Girls Center team will use these insights to inform how we summarize and share findings from Eager. It will continue to help deepen the resource for all of us and from this roadmap and to best support you in your work. So please share your thoughts on what will really be important questions that we should be focusing on going forward. So as a reminder, menti.com, you can use the code on your screen there, 6024320, and that'll be our final question. And we can maybe switch to the results as they come in. And with that, I'll just end with a few parting words. I think we all really want to here we already have some great results coming in, as we can see. And COVID-19 is right there on the top, but many important pieces around how to scale our work and to take a consultative approach and to work together. So lots of things that we're hoping Eager continue to drive and be a resource for. So in parting, I think we all want to know that at Echidna Giving, we are really committed to continuing the support for Eager as long as this is something that's really helpful to the educational field and is supportive of your work. We're really happy that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and UK FCDO has joined us in ongoing support for Eager. So it has some terrific support to really continue to deepen it. So please do share your thoughts and feedback as we continue to build this resource together to be useful to all of us. We're also hope that you will join us in sharing your work. It's really, Eager is representative of all of us that have contributed to it. Eager now has a function that is a living resource that we intend it to be, where you can continue to update your work and provide useful information from the community. So please be aware that you can interact with the team and interact with the website and be able to continue to enhance it and build on it. In just the last few months, actually, Eager team has already added more than 100 new projects developed in response to COVID-19, which is terrific. So in the coming weeks, they will be reaching out to many of you as well in the broader community to urge you to share some of the updates of your work in the past year. And this will, again, really help continue that focus on it being a living resource for all of us. It has many new features in terms of where organizations can create their own profiles and update the information directly. So please check back with Eager. And of course, finally check back to today to even see the roadmap for yourself. You can download the full report, which is a wealth of information, a really rich resource, and there is a great short summary as well, all free on the Eager website. And please continue to share this with anyone in your community that you think will be helpful and be informed by the information. So I look forward to continuing these discussions with many of you as we continue to see together how we can better align our needs, evidence, and practice to ensure that we are making the best investments and supporting the best work in the global girls' education community. So thank you all again so much. As you can see on the screen, there's great ways to reach the roadmap and the summary and engage with Eager. And we're just so grateful that you spent your time together with us today to learn more about the roadmap. And we look forward to continuing on this path to improving gender equality for all. Thank you so much.